We've all heard the saying, there's safety in numbers. But what happens when the crowd is headed straight off a cliff? It's about recognizing that even intelligent people can make bad decisions when they're part of a group that's stopped thinking critically. Imagine this, a group of people, convinced they've struck gold, pouring their life savings into a business venture that's obviously doomed to fail. From disastrous financial bubbles to political movements built on misinformation, the consequences of collective foolishness can be devastating. The problem is that when we're part of a group, our desire to fit in, to conform, can override our better judgment. Imagine a single person whispering a rumor. On its own, it's just that a whisper, easily dismissed. But now, picture that whisper echoed and amplified by 100, 1,000, 1,000,000 voices. This is the power of the group in its most alarming form, the ability to take individual ignorance and amplify it to a deafening volume. When people who share a lack of critical thinking come together, their biases and misconceptions don't cancel out. They compound. Like a game of telephone gone wrong, information gets distorted, assumptions solidify into facts, and dissenting voices are drowned out by the sheer volume of the chorus. This is how conspiracy theories thrive, how harmful stereotypes are perpetuated, and how dangerous ideologies gain a foothold. Have you ever felt trapped in an echo chamber, surrounded by people who only reinforce your existing beliefs? It's a comfortable space, but it's also a breeding ground for intellectual stagnation and, ultimately, collective foolishness. The key is recognizing when we're trapped in one and actively seeking out diverse perspectives. Sometimes the best way to understand a complex concept is to simplify it, to boil it down to its most absurd form. Imagine a group of people convinced that the Earth is flat, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. These analogies highlight a crucial point. Collective foolishness often stems from a disconnect from reality, from a willingness to embrace beliefs and engage in behaviors that defy common sense and contradict readily available evidence. History is littered with cautionary tales of collective foolishness, moments when entire societies seem to lose their grip on reason, often with catastrophic consequences. Take, for instance, the Salem witch trials of the late 17th century. The rise of Nazi Germany, fueled by propaganda, nationalism, and a toxic ideology of racial purity, demonstrates how a group's willingness to embrace hateful rhetoric and dehumanize entire populations can have horrific consequences. The financial world, with its complex systems and high-stakes gambles, provides a fertile breeding ground for collective foolishness. One of the most famous examples of this phenomenon is the Dutch tulip mania of the 17th century. Centuries later, the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s and early 2000s demonstrated that the allure of irrational exuberance remained as potent as ever. The classic fairy tale. The Emperor's New Clothes provides a timeless allegory for collective foolishness. In the story, two weavers convince a vain emperor that they can create garments so fine that they are invisible to those who are unfit for their office or hopelessly stupid. It takes a single dissenting voice, a solitary individual willing to point out the obvious, to shatter the illusion and expose the folly for what it is. We humans are social creatures. We crave connection, belonging, and the comfort of knowing we're part of something larger than ourselves. This deep-seated need to fit in is hardwired into our biology, a legacy of our evolutionary past, where survival often depended on our ability to cooperate and conform to group norms. But true progress, both individually and collectively, often requires us to challenge the status quo, to question accepted truths, and to chart our own course, even when it means standing alone. Section 2. Peer pressure's powerful grip from fashion choices to moral compromises. Peer pressure. It's a term often associated with adolescence, conjuring up images of teenagers succumbing to the influence of their peers. Whether it's adopting the latest fashion trends, experimenting with drugs and alcohol, or engaging in risky behavior. But peer pressure doesn't disappear in adulthood. It shapes our choices, behaviors, and values throughout our lives. Have you ever felt pressured to conform to a company culture that didn't sit right with you, to work long hours at the expense of your personal life, or to turn a blind eye to unethical behavior to protect your job? These are all examples of peer pressure in action, albeit in a more adult guise. The stakes may be higher, the consequences more severe, but the underlying dynamic remains the same. The desire to fit in, to be part of the team, can lead us to make compromises we might otherwise reject. Peer pressure's grip is particularly strong when it comes to matters of morality and ethics. We are socialized from a young age to conform to societal norms, to obey authority figures, and to avoid challenging the status quo. This conditioning can make it difficult to speak out against injustice, to challenge authority, or to defend our values when they conflict with those of the group. The courage to resist peer pressure, to stand up for what we believe is right, even when it's unpopular, is a hallmark of true integrity. It requires us to cultivate a strong internal compass, to develop the critical thinking skills to assess situations objectively, and to find the inner strength to act in accordance with our values, even when it means going against the grain. Section 3. The bystander effect, when silence speaks volumes. Imagine this. You're walking down a crowded street when you witness an act of aggression, perhaps someone being harassed or assaulted. You feel a surge of alarm, a desire to intervene, to help. But then you look around and notice that no one else seems to be reacting. People are averting their gaze, hurrying past, pretending they haven't seen anything. You hesitate, doubt creeps in, and you convince yourself that someone else must have already called for help, that it's not your place to get involved. This unsettling scenario illustrates a powerful psychological phenomenon known as the bystander effect. In emergency situations, the presence of others can paradoxically decrease the likelihood of any one person taking action. We look to others for cues, assuming that if no one else is reacting, the situation must not be as serious as we initially thought. We become paralyzed by indecision, our sense of individual responsibility diffused by the anonymity of the crowd. The bystander effect is a chilling example of how collective inaction can enable harmful behavior. When no one speaks up, when everyone remains silent, it sends a message that the behavior is acceptable, that the victim doesn't deserve our help. And this silence becomes a form of complicity, allowing injustice and cruelty to flourish unchecked. Breaking free from the bystander effect requires us to cultivate a sense of personal responsibility, to recognize that we have a moral obligation to act when we witness wrongdoing, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. It means finding our voices, speaking out against injustice, and offering support to those in need, even if it means standing alone. Section 1. Cultivating critical thinking, arming yourself against nonsense. Alright, so we've established that collective foolishness is a thing. It's real, it's out there, and it has the potential to be pretty darn destructive. But here's the good news. We're not powerless against it. Just as individuals can get swept up in the tide of groupthink, they can also learn to resist it, to chart their own course, and to think critically about the world around them. Critical thinking. It's a term thrown around a lot these days, but what does it actually mean? In essence, it's about engaging with information actively and thoughtfully, rather than passively accepting everything we see and hear. It's about asking questions, challenging assumptions, considering multiple perspectives, and forming our own informed opinions. Think of your brain as a finely tuned BS detector. When you encounter new information, whether it's a news article, a social media post, or even a conversation with a friend, don't just accept it at face value. Ask yourself, who's saying this? What's their agenda? What evidence do they have to support their claims? Are there other perspectives I should consider? Developing strong critical thinking skills takes time and effort, but it's one of the most valuable investments you can make in yourself. It's about becoming a more discerning consumer of information, a more thoughtful participant in discussions, and a more independent thinker capable of navigating the complexities of the world with wisdom and discernment. Questioning the narrative, unmasking the illusion of consensus. One of the most insidious aspects of collective foolishness is the illusion of consensus. When everyone around us seems to be singing from the same hymn sheet, it's easy to assume they must be onto something, that the prevailing narrative must be true. But history teaches us that this is often not the case. Some of the most harmful ideas in history, from slavery to eugenics to the demonization of entire groups of people, were once widely accepted, even considered common sense. The key to breaking free from this illusion of consensus is to cultivate a healthy skepticism, a willingness to question the status quo and to consider alternative perspectives. Just because something is popular, widely believed, or endorsed by authority figures doesn't automatically make it true. Think about the information you encounter, both online and offline. Who controls the narrative? Whose voices are being amplified and whose are being silenced? Are there underlying biases or agendas at play that might be shaping the information you're receiving? Don't be afraid to ask uncomfortable questions, to challenge the prevailing wisdom, to play devil's advocate. Embrace respectful dissent, engage in civil discourse with those who hold different views, and remember that the most dangerous form of ignorance is the belief that we already know everything. The power of one. Daring to dissent, embracing your inner contrarian. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of collective foolishness, like a lone voice crying out in the wilderness. But never underestimate the power of one. History is full of examples of individuals who dared to dissent, who challenged the status quo, and who, through their courage and conviction, helped to change the world. Think of Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus, sparking the Montgomery bus boycott and igniting the civil rights movement. Or Nelson Mandela, who spent decades imprisoned for his opposition to apartheid, only to emerge as a symbol of hope and reconciliation for a nation divided. These individuals weren't superhuman, they were ordinary people who found the courage to act on their beliefs, even when it was difficult, even when it was dangerous. They understood that silence is a form of consent, that inaction allows injustice to flourish, and that even small acts of resistance can have a ripple effect, inspiring others to find their voices and join the chorus of dissent. Embracing your inner contrarian doesn't mean being disagreeable for the sake of it. It's not about being a contrarian at all costs. It's about having the courage to think for yourself, to stand up for what you believe is right, and to speak out against injustice even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's unpopular. Remember, the emperor's new clothes were invisible to everyone until one small child dared to state the obvious. Your voice matters. Your willingness to question, to challenge, to dissent can be a powerful antidote to collective foolishness. Don't be afraid to use it. The antidote to collective foolishness, a call to conscious action. So, how do we navigate a world where collective foolishness often seems to reign supreme? It's tempting at times to throw up our hands in despair, to retreat into cynicism, to resign ourselves to the idea that humanity is doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. But that's precisely what the purveyors of groupthink want, for us to disengage, to become passive consumers of their carefully constructed narratives. The antidote to collective foolishness isn't complicated, it's just not always easy. It requires us to be vigilant, to be engaged, to be willing to do the hard work of thinking for ourselves. It's about recognizing the seductive allure of conformity, the comforting embrace of the echo chamber, and the insidious power of peer pressure. But it's also about remembering that we are not automatons, blindly following the herd. We are capable of independent thought, of critical analysis, of moral courage. We've explored the dangers of groupthink, the historical and contemporary examples of collective foolishness in action, and the psychological mechanisms that make us all susceptible. But knowledge without action is like a seed unplanted. It holds potential but yields no fruit. It's time to move beyond awareness and embrace conscious action, to become active participants in shaping a more informed, more just, and ultimately more rational world. This isn't about becoming a hermit, rejecting all forms of collective action, or viewing every group with suspicion. It's about finding a balance between our innate need to belong and our responsibility to think for ourselves, between respecting the opinions of others and holding fast to our own values, between engaging in constructive dialogue and calling out BS when we see it. The ripple effect of independent thinking, building a brighter future, one thought at a time. Imagine a world where critical thinking is the norm, where individuals approach information with skepticism, where respectful debate is encouraged, and the courage to speak one's truth is valued. The ripple effect of independent thinking is real. When one person dares to question the status quo, it creates a ripple of awareness. It emboldens others to find their voices and break free from groupthink. This isn't about achieving a grand utopian vision overnight. It's about incremental progress and planting seeds of critical thinking. So the next time you find yourself caught in the tide of collective opinion, take a deep breath, engage your critical thinking skills, and ask yourself, is this really what I believe? The answer might surprise you, and it might just change the world.